Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And today we are discussing the emergence of new economics. And this will be a general update, a worldwide update on the ongoing developments toward the provision of a basic income, of a living income, in essence, around the world. And so we will be discussing various articles that you will be able to read for yourself, as we will leave all of these links in the notes of this Hangout. And so it's about getting to know why is everyone now veering toward the idea of providing a living income, in essence, to save the economy in a way. And we are very glad to be discussing this topic with Jean Kenney from New York. Hi, Jean.
Hi. How are you?
Fine, thank you, and welcome to the Hangout. So to everyone, I need to remind you that the questions and comments for this Hangout are open for everyone. You simply have to log into your Google account. If you are watching on the YouTube video, you can click here or here where it says join our conversation. And so let's get on with this Hangout, Jean. We will be discussing about various articles, so let's get going. The first one that we have here is one written by Lars Christensen, who is a Danish economist that has participated as Ministry of Economic Affairs in Denmark and has a master's degree in economics from the University of Copenhagen. And so his article comes as a response to a discussion that we began in a previous Hangout about the pragmatic libertarian, so to speak, idea to provide a basic income by Matt Zwolinski. So this article is by Lars, and he's also bringing a very interesting idea that can be implemented in an ongoing situation in Venezuela, which we know is a country that is subsumed in absolute chaos, poverty, there's a lot of disruption, social problems there, and he's coming up with a solution that can actually create a point of stability based on oil and the actual wealth creation process in Venezuela. So, Jean, what can you tell us about this one?
Well, in the article, he discusses the privatization of the natural resource, which is the primary natural resource in Venezuela right now is oil, and it would be a creation of a citizen's account where money would be transferred directly into every citizen's account to be used how they see fit. So it's a dividend, a compensation in a sense that echoes something that Thomas Paine in the United States first observed, which is that that everybody has a natural inheritance to the resources of wherever they live or wherever they're from. So this is almost a common sense application of what should be obvious, which is that we all share in the natural resources of the land where we're from, and we should benefit from them equally. So Venezuela is taking the idea of well, his idea is that Venezuela do this. Now, his strategy is to privatize rather than have it be a government subsidy, which is more what Paine was talking about. He's talking about privatization of the oil business to distribute this oil wealth. And that's an interesting idea and one that might appeal more to Western capitalist countries. In terms of their fear of the socialist threat associated with the income distribution, so maybe this is a good way to quell those fears. So I guess that's my overview of that.
Yes, what's interesting is that it's similar to what we have proposed within the living income proposal, which I will leave a link to it in the description box of this video as well, in the sense that because Venezuela is already having state-owned companies, instead of calling it a nationalization process, Lars is calling it a denationalization process, which, as Jean explained, it's privatizing the old companies. And what he's saying is that instead of having the state then provide, for example, all these benefits that the state now controls, the more privatization takes place, people will be able to, with the money gotten in these citizen accounts, which will be funded by the oil revenue, in essence, from the privatization process. So people will directly benefit from that wealth that Venezuela is more than capable of creating, benefit the public, and so the public can stop depending so much on the government for their essential needs, because right now we know that in the news they are subsuming extreme poverty. They have to make long queues to get their basic benefits, and this is all because the government is not working for the benefit of them. So in this case, the oil wealth among Venezuelans can be redistributed through these citizen accounts. Hello to everyone watching. Thank you for your comment. So it is about like a liberalization process that takes place. And what's interesting is that Lars is actually saying that it doesn't have to be politicized, meaning it should be a constitutional right. It should be written in the constitution that Venezuelans should have access to this money. And obviously it will also have to attract investments, as you were mentioning, Jane. And also it is a fair share, meaning what happens right now and the current and ongoing situation in Venezuela is that there's no ability to improve the condition at all as long as the state holds control upon everything. Mm-hmm. So this is a very interesting proposal, and I've actually handed this article to a Venezuelan person so that they can actually get in contact with more people and maybe join together to think of this effort and actual solution to their situation. So it's quite interesting, and I suggest that you also read it out for the viewer. So let's get to our next article, which is a very interesting one and the one that has the most meat, so to speak. And it's called Print Less but Transfer More, and it's written by the people from Council of Foreign Relations. And it's quite an interesting place from which we get this kind of news, which in essence is implying that we have to start supporting the cash transfers or handing out money to people. So, Jean, tell us more about this interesting article.
Well, it is interesting because it's not something you would expect, like you said, from the CFR to be promoting what in many people's eyes would be income redistribution. But it seems from my novice point of view, whatever, I'm not an expert, but just from reading it, that there's a sense of defeat, that the QE, the quantitative easing, has not produced the desired results in the economy, and now there's a kind of, well, what do we do next? And maybe it's based on the actual studies and results of cash transfers that have existed recently, since more or less since 2000, in various countries throughout the world. The results that have come back from actual cash transfers, like in Uganda or India and different countries, that show that the majority of that money does actually boost spending. And the CFR in their article are interested in this problem of spending. It's not so much the overall systemic issue of how we created an economy that's, on its, on a life support, it's not doing so well. But asking, how can we boost spending? So it's just looking for an injection, another injection. Well, this may actually work to the benefit of everyone, because studies do show that this cash injection, when directly given to people, produces results. It produces actual jobs. It produces actual wealth, and it's unlike the QE formula, which is creating money and buying securities that are already shown to be bad debt and produce nothing. This could be another. This could be an actual practical use of energy. So let's see.
And an interesting aspect that they're laying out is, why hasn't the government done this before, and why hasn't any government tried this? Well, now we have India, which we will be talking about in a bit, So it's quite fascinating that in the organism that actually controls how the economy moves, because we're talking about the organism that has direct relation to the Federal Reserve in the US, is now realizing that, you know, we've plunged the economy into great crisis and nothing has worked. The deflation or the lowering of interest rates is not working because people would have to get into debt to then reactivate the economy, and what we have seen is the housing bubble of 2007, so that doesn't work. And if they want to, for example, print out more money, which is a QE that you were mentioning, it has proven to be just an inflationary bubble that is going nowhere because there's no real money getting to people, but it kind of remains in the levels of stock market and buying assets and so forth. So also what's interesting is that they say there's no real consensus of how to use tax and how to spend this money, and so how to efficiently stimulate the economy. So all of these fiscal policies are not really destined to benefit the ground, the lower income household, so to speak, which is what they are now looking into. So what about this aspect in terms of the spending process and also the fears that they had? Like, why hadn't they done this before?
I don't know. I think that, you know, it worked so well. The QEs were such great free money for the banks. I mean, they were supposed to loan that money out, but they didn't. And I think there was just this idea that we were sold a certain ideology or philosophy of how this economy was going to, you know, right itself, and it didn't. And now we're at a point where it's almost like a last-ditch effort. I don't know if this is a trial balloon, this idea, you know, with throwing it out there. I'm not savvy enough to know why it is that they would be now interested in this pretty radical, idea of income redistribution in a way.
Which is actually to our benefit, I would say,
yeah.
Of course,
Exactly.
because that's what is so surprising, that it's coming from them. And they're directly talking about central banks have to start providing these cash transfers to people, and mostly focusing on low-income people, which is something that we also relate to when we talk about the living income. It's providing money to people that do not have any means to get an income, for example, or are handicapped or cannot really get a job, for example. So there's that aspect of first support to those that need it the most, and then, you know, looking to providing higher wages, which is also another aspect that people tend to use very commonly as one obstacle. Like, no, if we hand out this money, this cash transfer, this living income, for example, then wages will be stagnated. But it doesn't have to be, because the way that, for example, instead of taxing the rich guys can instead provide higher wages. So you don't need to tax the rich because that's an unpopular move, but rather ask them that in their corporations they rather give more money to people that actually work, giving higher wages. And so it is also to remind that every government or every society can decide the measures and the alignments that they decide to place onto this provision of money, these cash transfers, this living income, basic income, whichever the name it is. But in essence, that the point is to benefit everyone from the ground up, which is what now people are realizing is the actual solution to revive the economy, which is awesome.
Well, and hopefully it'll be enough money that it'll make a difference. I mean, $200 is not going to do it, but enough money for startups. And like you said, it doesn't matter what the motivation is. It could be that the Fed wants to keep control over the control of money. I mean, they don't want to address the fiscal crisis of what caused this, because that would be a legislative issue. That would be something that actually everybody would have to work on and figure out a solution to. I mean, that ultimately is the best way to address this problem. But in terms of where we're at now, the Fed is controlling the monetary system. We have chosen the road of monetary policy rather than fiscal policy. So we're sort of, do we start from where we're at, or do we just, or do we hope for some theoretical future? So it's probably best to try to work with what's here and figure out how that can best serve the most people. And I think that's always what we're looking at, is we're willing to look at every option in terms of boots on the ground. Will it actually affect people's lives? Will it help them get out of poverty now, rather than, saying, well, we can't do that because it doesn't fit into our philosophy, when the philosophy really is that everybody be lifted out of poverty to start.
Yes, of course. And it's now are also now agreeing with that cash transfers must come from the central bank, that they are actually enabled or able to do that right away. So it's a matter of actually deciding at a governmental level, for example, to do so. And what happens is that why everyone wants more spending, of course, is to increase the demand and so revive the economy. But what happens right now is that because of this stagnation, this austerity that is overall in this world, people don't spend. For example, they explain how middle-aged people stop spending in goods and services because they are actually now preparing for their retirement and lacking a proper pension plan, for example.
Right.
So that is also why spending is not working, and it's not being very incentivized, so to speak. So we have to then revive the economy through handing out money so that people stop fearing spending and actually spend more, support themselves, and get out of poverty, of course, with low-income households who are mostly, subsumed in poverty,
And mostly children.
Exactly. We have a comment from Gabriela Seves, and he's saying, in the book written by John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, is explained the dynamics of how the countries get in an extreme amount of debt to promote this so-called enhancement within the infrastructure that in the end is charged to the debt. And yes, that's a whole topic in itself of how, for example, in nations like Africa, they provide these loans with great interest, which is aimed at having control over the resources. So that's mostly like what's happening from first world nations to third world nations, and a form of empowerment, which is, yes, the process of expanding the empire, getting all the resources. That's a new word.
I like that, yeah.
So
predatory lending. I mean, that's, predatory lending and predatory behavior is, yes, rampant. And there is no easy solution to that. I mean, that's why we're grabbing at straws, whatever we can work with.
Yeah. So right now it's really looking at boosting the bottom. And that's what really works with also what we propose. We have to look at solutions on the ground, as you were mentioning. And so also they suggest that people then get more aware of how to better invest in their future, because it's not to take this money as a lottery transfer, so to speak, but to actually, we're aware that maybe at the beginning people will get the money and spend it in something that they're really not supportive maybe, but as you go, you will be learning how to invest it in your future, which means maybe paying your education, paying off your debt, maybe buying a house. So getting that point of stability also for people, as you have this money now invested wisely. So we've been talking a lot about educating each other to best spend this money, because eventually this will be required also for us to be smart consumers and actually use that money wisely. And also we have to look at that like self-investment. When we invest back into our lives, obviously the overall living standard will be upgraded. Any last comments on this?
Well, the idea of what people do with the money, I think the important news that's come out from economic policy research institutes and the UN and variety of different nonprofits and NGOs is that the surprise in the last 10 years of that the people who get these cash transfers actually make the right choices, that they use the money to buy clothes, food, all the things that they actually need. In Uganda, they had a program where they gave groups of people who were intended to create a business, they gave them cash, $10,000, group of 10 people. They spent half of it on supplies, half of it on training, and within 4 years they were making 50% more than they had made the previous year. I mean, people don't want to be in poverty; they want to have their own. And the cash transfer shows that actually, it surprises everybody. And now it's not a question of if; it's a question of when they're going to start. I mean, they're really changing these programs to be more cash transfer payment rather than in subsidies.
Yes,
So,
and also what we have discussed before in terms of the welfare system, how there has been many programs that were scattered all over, so now they can funnel all the welfare systems, as Matt Zwolinski had explained, which is another cool reason to simplify the process, and also in terms of ensuring this as a living right, which is what we mostly propose, so that it can get a constitutional level, and it's not able to be politicized. It's not debatable. It's simply a process in which we integrate each other into the flow of the economy, empowering each other.
yes, so like progressives see it as a fulfillment of everyone's natural right to these, to a living standard of decency, and on the right, it appeals to people in the United States, or should, to conservatives, in that it's a cutback on bureaucracy. It's an elimination of huge amounts of government control. It's direct deposit, as we see in the next article in India. It can be directly deposited. There doesn't have to be this vast middleman. And it's an act of faith in the sense of human potential of what people actually want to do, which is be creative and make things and share them and have a regular economy. Doesn't need to be the John Perkins, model of predatory capitalism in that regard. It can be a capitalism that is a living capitalism that supports everybody, where everybody has enough capital to live. So the whole left-right, argument really doesn't hold water when it comes down to living rights for everybody. That's not a political issue of decency. It shouldn't be in any way.
Yeah, or ideological, because that's why we won't even go into whether it is a libertarian move to provide a basic income guarantee, for example, but it is simply a matter of what can work. What's your perspective, just as the last point on this article, on what they deem as a criticism that comes to this idea, which is, it's socialist handouts? What's your perspective, also being in America?
Well, I mean, the biggest socialist handout that's happened in the last 100 years has been the bailout of the banks. I mean, that's the biggest wealth transfer. I mean, so the 1% is like living. I forget what the proportional difference is, but it's outrageous. It's like there's been nothing like it since since feudal times in terms of the wealth disparity, and that is a direct correlation to the QE, to the system that the Fed tried to pursue, which has ended up only benefiting the very wealthy. I mean, the stock market has gone crazy, and the only people that really benefit from that are people with a lot of money. So in that regard, I would say get your head out of your ass, because the actual crimes of the redistribution are right in front of us, but it's kind of a cognitive dissonance, because it's not called that.
Exactly.
Because it doesn't have the face of communism. It's missed for what it is. It's actually the same idea of an elite benefiting off the backs of the majority.
Yes, and it's actually a socialist move, as you were mentioning, to bail out banks. So there is a huge cognitive dissonance there going on, and actually some critics and economists say that America is the most socialist country at the moment. So it's time to really let go of these name tags and rather focus on what we are also now placing out here as direct solutions. And so within that, getting through all of these ideologies and communist fears and socialists and all of that type of discourse is kind of like the old past century type of discourse. We are now working on the new economics. So let's move on, Jean, onto our third article, which is the first step towards a welfare reform. And this is talking about the government in India trying to reconfigure their leaky welfare system through providing cash transfers to all the population. So what can you tell us about this one?
Well, it's an interesting program because they want to, it's a direct cash benefit to Indian families, but they have a little problem in that the majority of Indian families who are poor don't have bank accounts. So that is the only means test that they're, that they're confronting, which is making sure that people get bank accounts so that they can be given this simple non-discretionary income transfer. It should be a very interesting object lesson because they've had like the United States, they have a huge bureaucratic problem. They have a huge welfare. They have all kinds of welfare scams that have been going on and money that's been missing. So hopefully this will address that, and it should be interesting to see what happens with that.
Yes, and I like how they call it. It is a financial inclusion program, which is then veered toward including everyone from the ground up. And in the process of 2 years, it is meant to then become like a universal basic income, which is an unconditional transfer of money. And the usual way, because we also do not call living income an unconditional point, because we see it as a double move to give money to the wealthy, for example, and then have it back through taxation on the rich or else. So instead of that, we rather say, well, I mean, it's cool if the government can afford to give to everyone. That's great. But if you can just make it simpler, then simply do not give that money to the rich. And as we were mentioning before, then the rich can, for example, in their companies, they can provide higher wages, and that can be their way to provide their bit of support within the living income guarantee proposal context, which is providing the living income, and to those that work, providing higher wages. So, and also it's interesting because it is providing this access to banks and providing this transfer process that is also linked to new technologies, and that is also what we propose, that eventually cash in itself is not transferred, but it becomes like a digital process. So this also goes hand in hand with innovation and creativity that is part of the new kind of monetary policies that should be implemented, because we're still using a model from over a century ago, which doesn't make sense because we've moved on. So India is now kind of like a spearhead on this process. Right. And what we were discussing before, which is also interesting, is that because India is now part of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa bloc, maybe now that they're coming forward with this idea, it is maybe a reason for the IMF and the UN and the CFR to come up with this idea of, oh, maybe that's really the way forward. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it very well might be that they've inspired this, and hopefully they have. Because, I mean, I guess the whole point of our discussion, too, was to show the worldwide movement towards an acknowledgement that a basic income is something that is whose time has arrived. And you have Switzerland, they're expected to hold a referendum this fall, I think in October, right? Whether they're going to have a guaranteed income for all their citizens, which amounts to $20,000 or something like that. So it's a great, great benefit to the Swiss. But
yes, we've discussed the Swiss proposal also before, right. And it's certainly a good example. But I do consider that this Indian proposal is even more revolutionary for the amount of people that India has as a population, and also because Switzerland already has like a good living standard, whereas India, most of the population would be really poor. So we are really having our eyes on how this develops, and it will be a great example for a big nation to do this kind of move. And right. So we will keep our eyes on that. Shall we move on to the next one?
Yeah, just to finish that up, though, there's been some successful transfers too. There's Iran has had a cash transfer success story. Jordan, Mauritania, Morocco, Yemen. So it's not just, a few countries, it's quite a few. And the UN system itself, the debate, they say, is no longer about whether these transfers should be done, but how they should be done. So, like you said, in India, every country has unique problems. In India, you have a massive rural population that don't have access to banks. So, that's the first thing that has to be tackled in that country. So every country is going to have different. Iran is it's a first world country, and that's not the issue. They have other issues. So, every country will have its own unique barriers to how to provide these cash transfers.
Yes, exactly. And we go to the next one quite briefly. MACAU government distributes temporary basic income. What do we know about MACAU, Jean?
Well, the government of MACAU is, I guess, quite wealthy from their popular casinos and whatnot, so they have a lot of money, and the government now is going to start distributing some of that income to all of its citizens, and it's a partial basic income. It has no strings attached, and it's similar to Alaska in that it's going to be voted on every year whether or not to continue it, but most likely it will be continued like in Alaska, where there's never been no one's ever wanted to stop that. And we'll see what happens. Right now it's not enough to live on, but at least it's a start. So it's a great, acknowledgement of the shared resources, whatever they are. If it's a casino, fine. It doesn't have to be a natural resource.
Very cool point here, that because when we talk about nationalization of certain industries to fund the living income, for example, in Venezuela, it's very clear that the wealth comes from the oil. But in a place like MACAU, they don't have maybe such kind of natural resources, but they can use the casino industry to get the benefit from that and give their fair share to each individual from the nation. So that is also another example of how it can be done if
Right.
you take the most wealth creation industry, company, etc., and use that to then give it back to the society, and everyone will be flourishing in that sense.
And the important point there, too, is like as in Alaska, it's a legislative procedure that created that. Somebody wrote the legislation that said, why don't we do this, and was voted on. I mean, this could happen in Nevada. You have casinos, great casino wealth, maybe not so much now, but a few years ago you did similarly. So just to get back to the infrastructure is there, the government is there. In most Western countries where you have a democratic, you have the ability to write legislation, you have the ability to create these laws and have people vote on them. It's more like, remembering that we can use the system that's here to implement these ideas in a practical way. It's not something that's completely out of left field.
Absolutely, and also it is a way to get ourselves working at a democratic level. It is empowering to then, as a citizen, decide to vote on this, to inform yourself why it has been beneficial on other places, and that's why we will be also sharing all of these links, so that people that are interested on these measures can realize that, hey, this is happening all over the world, so let's get moving ourselves as well.
Right.
So let's get on to our next article, which has a resonance to what we have discussed previously in a very early hangout here about South Africa and the mining process, and why weren't the people being benefited from the great wealth that is extracted from their mines. So we have this article that it's a discussion of a basic income from mineral rights in South Africa. What can you tell us about it?
I am going to defer to you on that one. Because I don't have my notes in front of me. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm going to just read very quickly the basic aspect, which is the proceeds of mining beyond the current narrow circle of national and international beneficiaries and shareholders of the mining companies and aligned elites who are mostly interested in this process, to each and every resident of the South African development community sub-region, which is something that we have been talking about, making the people empowered through one of the main activities, which in this case in South Africa is mining. So this is only to confirm that this kind of measures should have been taken long ago, and that more so Africa in itself can be a topic on its own because of the amount of wealth and resources that are being extracted through the methods that we were discussing previously with Gabriel's comments. So that is a move, a step forward on this similar process of creating this solution. Then we have the UN Transfer Project. So if you have if you would like to share with us.
Well, the UN Transfer Project is another cash infusion. More or less, that's geared towards, from what I can tell, is situations of extreme need. So it's not so much a universal universal infusion. It's more with actual extreme poverty. But it turns out to be quite a success. As I mentioned, the Uganda experiment and cash transfers in all these other countries, and it results in a 50 to 75% reaching the bottom 40% of the population, compared with only reaching 20% through subsidies. Big difference. So the UN, the UN is definitely in the forefront of this.
Which is also interesting, because from there we can have a more impact on every other nation's ability to combat poverty, so to speak, which is also another mission of providing a living income, in essence. And also to understand that the criticisms based on, well, there's not going to be many people that want to work, or else it has been proven so that people actually do better when they are given this money. And what I would like to see is, of course, more greater nations adopting this kind of solutions, because then we will see that it's not only in poverty subsumed communities that get into this kind of mentality of let's become more productive, let's support ourselves more, but see, for example, how an American nation could benefit and would work with a basic income or a living income, for example.
And the other thing I just want to say too is that a lot of times there's a black and white, view that you can have of international organizations, NGOs, and their ties to nation states and their ties to the agenda standards or building of these nations, so that you can say, well, they're all part of a system of exploitation, perhaps, or they're not really there to, but you have to kind of, I think it's important to look at the facts, look at the programs, and see, because I don't think we can make these blanket statements and completely discount NGOs, foundations, or whatever as being necessarily in cahoots with this type of predatory lending or predatory capitalism. And I think a lot of times it's easy to go to the extreme and discount the whole spectrum of non-governmental organizations as being suspect, or the other way, that uncritically accepting everything that they do and say as being good. So I think there's a critical, important, and I'm speaking to myself too, because it's important to just be critical, look at the facts, and see what's actually happening. Is money getting to people? My suggestion to myself and to anyone else is to put aside prejudice in terms of preconceived ideas about what these organizations represent, especially with the UN. A lot of having grown up in with this idea that the UN could do no wrong, and then flipping to the other side of thinking it's like the handmaiden to the evil empires. I think that the truth lies somewhere in between, and that there's lots of really good examples of how these well-meaning, some well-meaning applications of money, grants, and things like that can actually work, and we can use what's here that's working, and not throw the whole baby out with the bathwater, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, exactly. Like actually getting to research, and we've been surprised of finding, as you were mentioning, this information coming from these organizations. There's a lot of other projects like the Bolsa Familia in Brazil. We're running out of time, so we will simply say that it is a social welfare in Brazil, and it is a conditional type of cash transfers. Any quick comments on that, Jean?
That it's helped tens of millions of people, not tens of thousands of people. I mean, tens of millions of people have been lifted out of extreme poverty in Brazil through this one program. And whether or not we agree with everything, and whether or not there's not certainly room for improvement, etc., yeah. But, you know, children are no longer, so, you know, to say that there aren't models, you know, that are easily, you know, that we can use in whatever country. That's the main in that way as to what are the results. And
exactly.
Keep improving.
And that's also the conclusion that, going back to the Council of Foreign Relations article, goes back to. It is about time that this measure takes place. It is not a matter of why or if we should, but it's how and when is it going to get done. So within this, we would like to give closure to this hangout by saying to everyone that we are the Living Income Guarantee proposal, which means there is more to just handing out money. There are a series of alignments and suggestions that can be done in any country's economy according to their resources, according to their possibility and capability of providing a living income, and a series of measures that will also tackle and address some of the obstacles that people somehow bring up when it comes to handing out money, to giving these cash transfers, for example, because we do look at the whole perspective of how the economy will be influenced by these sudden emerging new participants in the economy as people that previously had no money. So we invite you to read it, of course, to leave comments in this video, and also to remind you that if you would like to take part in these conversations, you're more than welcome to say, I want to join in, and we will contact you. Any last words, Jean, on this topic?
I think you summed it up well. I think that there's a danger, you know, of paternalism, of knowing what you think is right when we don't necessarily know what the best method to achieve these goals are, and it's about being open to alternatives and to avoid any knee-jerk reaction you may have as far as what people do with money and what they're going to do, and assuming that you know, and if you haven't really looked at it, if you haven't looked at the results of these studies, of these actual cash transfers that show the results of what people actually do, which is they actually do build their own lives, independent lives that produce goods and services, then you haven't done your homework. And so it's to realize that, you know, you and the person in Uganda are basically the same person. You know, everybody wants the same things. We all want to have independence. We all want to have a livelihood that's right. So it's to give us you would like to receive is the basic, you know, common sense thread here.
Absolutely, and let those be the last words for this hangout. We will also leave a link to what Federico also explained, because he used to be not on the side of providing a universal basic income, which is what he now proposes. He speaks of hard data, wherein he explains why it works, so we will leave that for your homework, so to speak. And I fully agree with Jean. This is about also educating ourselves and reading and getting to see why it works and making up our mind, because this is about supporting each other to live in a dignified manner around the world. So thanks for your time, Jean. Thanks for being in this hangout.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And thanks to you, the viewer. And remember that you can subscribe to this YouTube channel. And we will see you next Sunday at the same time. So keep an eye on the next topic. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.